It is one of the world's most battle-hardened militaries, surrounded by enemies on all sides, whose soldiers are tasked with one mission: never lose a war. But the Israeli Defense Force has a hard-won reputation for pulling off improbable victories with unconventional tactics, and is now leading the fight into Gaza in an effort to wipe out Hamas. Forced to fight 5 major conflicts in its first 4 decades of existence, it secured one improbable win after another, including the Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War, and, most importantly, the War of Independence, during which it was fought. The Israel-Palestine conflict has led to untold suffering over these decades of conflict, but the IDF has emerged as one of the world's best armies. Bristling with high-tech, homemade weapons like the Iron Dome and Mengapa tank, which allow it to hold off attacks and strike back with overwhelming force. They were among the first to develop combat drones, have already deployed AI on the battlefield, and are now on the cusp of producing laser cannons. They have blasted a missile out of the edge of space, are responsible for one of the world's best spy networks, and were among the first militaries to allow women to fight on the front line. This is the story of how the IDF came to be, the weapons, the tech, and the tactics that made its name, and why it looks set to remain one of the absolute best for years to come. The IDF has a reputation for doing things differently. While most armies are underpinned by strict hierarchy, formal discipline, and long-standing traditions, the Israeli army is not, a lot of which has to do with its history. Formed by David Ben-Gurion, the father of Israel, in the midst of the 1948 War of Independence, the IDF was originally made up of separate Jewish militias, thrown together under one banner and forced to fight for their very survival from day one. Against all the odds, the IDF managed not only to defeat the 7 Arab armies that invaded Israel on the day of its birth, but pushed them back beyond what were intended to be the country's original borders. For the Palestinians, this was the beginning of the Nakba, the disaster in English, which saw hundreds of thousands displaced from their homes into refugee camps where their descendants live to this day. But for the IDF, this victory was the cornerstone of their fearsome reputation and established a deep-seated culture of doing what works over doing things by the book, which persists to this day. Take, for example, the development of the Mengapa tank, widely regarded as one of the world's best, which was delivered by Israel's fledgling defense industry on time, under budget, and in the middle of a recession. The brain behind it was Israel Tal, better known as Talik, a former commander and hero of the Six-Day War, which Israel fought against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in 1967. In the wake of that conflict, both France and Britain, which until then had been supplying Israel with heavy armor, began to restrict the supply, convincing Israel it needed to produce its own. The tank that Talik designed prioritized crew safety above everything else. He realized, correctly, that the hardest part of the vehicle to replace were the men inside, who took months to recruit and train, and years to perfect in the art of tank warfare. Working alongside other tank commanders to identify the biggest problems they faced in battle, his design included innovations like moving the engine to the front of the vehicle. This meant when the tank was hit head-on by a shell, the most common way they were attacked back then, the engine shielded the crew from the blast. It made the tank more vulnerable to being disabled on the battlefield, but it ensured the men inside lived to fight another day. Freeing up space at the back also meant it could be fitted with a rear hatch, allowing the crew to escape if it was disabled, and creating room for it to carry extra men, protecting soldiers going into battle and casualties coming back out again. Talik also insisted on a low, long gun turret, which made the Mengapa hard to see at range and perfect for long-distance sniping, a tactic he developed to keep his men out of harm's way for as long as possible. Now, on its 5th iteration, the Mengapa has evolved according to the principles that Talik and the IDF laid down: self-reliance, utility, and safety driven by problems identified in battle. Take, for example, the distinctive ball and chain defenses which hang off the back of the turret and were developed to stop rockets hitting a weak spot that was identified between the turret and the hull, or explosive reactive armor, special plates which burst outwards to deflect incoming rockets and shells, which are now standard the world over, but were first adopted by the Israelis. It wasn't even their invention. It was actually developed by a German who first tried to sell it to the Bundeswehr, but were told they were not planning to strap explosives to their own tanks before Tel Aviv realized the true value of it. The logic which inspired that armor later led to the creation of the trophy system, which protects the vehicles today. It is a one-of-a-kind piece of kit that uses radar to detect incoming rounds and then fires small explosive charges to destroy them in midair. Completely automated, meaning the crew inside don't have to do a thing to activate it, Israel claims it has a 95% hit rate, which has proved invaluable at stopping Hamas rockets during the attack on Gaza. It is so accurate, it can even be used to create a protective bubble for troops operating near the tank, as it is able to take out rockets without harming them. Each member of a Mengapa crew is now equipped with a VR helmet similar to the ones used in F-35 jets, which give them a 360 view of the battlefield outside the tank. Meanwhile, artificial intelligence helps the tank speak to other units on the battlefield to quickly identify targets and take them out. The trade-off with all this equipment is that the Mengapa is also the world's heaviest tank, but since Israel is the only country that uses it, transporting all that weight long distance isn't an issue. Years after the IDF's creation, in 1953, Ben-Gurion took a break from running the country to sit down and write Israel's first and only official security concept, outlining what the IDF's mission was and setting a blueprint for how it would fight. At the top of his priority list was that Israel could never lose a war, because doing so would mean the wholesale destruction of the country. That means the IDF is defensive. It is not designed to start fights, but to end them, as quickly and as decisively as possible. In Ben-Gurion's vision, this meant rapidly mobilizing an overwhelming force, pushing the fight onto the enemy's territory, and then crushing the threat utterly. This still forms the bedrock of the IDF's defense strategy today, which it accomplishes via mandatory conscription for both men and women, with only a few exceptions on the basis of religion, family obligations, or disability. Minimum length of service is 24 months, followed by decades spent on standby in the reserves, ready to be called up in a time of crisis, such as the October 7th Hamas terror attack. And the IDF can mobilize its reserves quicker than virtually every other country. In just a few days, it had 300,000 pairs of boots on the ground ready to go into Gaza, compared to months for Putin to rally half that number to send into Ukraine. And most combat roles are open to both sexes as well. Until 2001, female conscripts were funneled into the Women's Corps, which took on the bulk of the admin work and other jobs like nursing, radio operation, and flight control. But as a lot of that work started to be automated, the IDF decided to allow women onto the front line rather than lose them from the force altogether. Nowadays, almost 90% of roles within the IDF are open to women, and while the numbers who choose to serve on the front line are small, they are also growing rapidly. There are currently 4 mixed-sex battalions, of which the Caracal Battalion was the first, which these days has 70% female soldiers. A 5th such battalion is being created. 13 of Caracal's female soldiers led the fight back on October 7th, when they helped reclaim one of the kibbutz overrun by Hamas, killing a reported 100 terrorists in the process. The only positions not open to women are in the armoured, heavy infantry or special forces units, where repeated heavy lifting has led to concerns of injuries, though some light special forces should open up to female recruits in 2025. Infantry and armour make up the bulk of the IDF's forces. It operates 2,500 tanks and 5,000 armoured vehicles, despite its relatively small size, but the tip of the spear is its state-of-the-art Air Force. Named the world's most powerful by Business Insider magazine back in 2014, the IAF is designed to hold up any attack with airstrikes until the reserves can be mobilized. It relies heavily on American F-16s and Apache helicopter gunships for this, but it also operates several dozen latest generation F-35 stealth fighters. Israel also has a navy to keep it safe from threats in the Mediterranean, which these days mostly involves stopping Iranian weapons getting to Gaza via the coast. Specialist warships are also thought to operate Israel's tactical nuclear deterrent. The final pillar of the IDF is Amman, its unconventional military intelligence arm which works alongside Shin Bet, responsible for domestic security, and the infamous Mossad, which covers overseas, to form the Israeli intelligence community. Together, these three agencies are responsible for providing the IDF early warning of terror threats and attacks and are regarded as some of the world's best. The spirit of innovation which drives the IDF also carries over into Israel's defense industry, which is among the most advanced in the world. In total, more than 150 defense companies are thought to operate in the country, but the main ones are Israel Aerospace Industries, the Rafael Arms Development Authority, and Elbit Systems, which acquired Israel Military Industries several years ago. Innovations produced by these companies include the Uzi submachine gun and the Israeli bandage, an elasticated dressing designed to stop bleeding, which is used by the US. But perhaps the most famous is the Iron Dome, which was developed by Rafael as a joint project with America and went into action in 2011. It is one of the most advanced missile defenses in use anywhere in the world, designed to take down short-range rockets and artillery shells in response to Hamas attacks out of Gaza, which began in 2006. It uses radar to detect incoming rockets and computers to work out whether they are aimed at populated areas before firing Tamir interceptor missiles to take them down. The Tamir travel at 2.5 times the speed of sound, guided by radar, before sensors in the missile take over for the last part of its journey, detonating it close enough to the incoming rocket to destroy it. Meanwhile, Israel Aerospace pioneered the use of drones in combat, putting some of the first into the skies way back in the 1970s to spy on their enemies, before giving them the ability to hit ground targets in the 1990s. Today, drones are Israel's largest weapon export, overtaking missile technology in 2022 off the back of the Ukraine war and earning billions of dollars in revenue. In total, Israel's weapon exports earned it $12.5 billion in 2022 alone, much of which is pumped back into research and development to ensure the IDF maintains a technological edge over its foes. The next leap forward is likely to come straight out of science fiction, as Rafael is preparing to deploy the next iteration of the Iron Dome, dubbed Iron Beam. This uses lasers instead of rockets to shoot down incoming missiles, making the system much cheaper to run. Some estimates suggest it will cost around $2 per intercept instead of the current $20,000. Meanwhile, another futuristic development is the Smash 2000 rifle sight, essentially a targeting computer that mounts on top of a rifle. Soldiers look through the box sight, which identifies and outlines possible targets, before locking onto one of them with the push of a button. The sight then calculates the distance to target and movement before providing a second outline that the soldier should fire at in order to hit it. Sharpshooter, the company which makes the sight, says this is particularly useful for taking down drones like the FPVs which have been terrorizing infantry and tanks in Ukraine. A new version of the system, which is currently in production, has been bought by the Americans. Born into war and given a baptism of fire, the IDF now stands tall as one of the world's best military outfits and an example to others of how to accomplish a lot with limited resources. It has been responsible for innovations in both tactics and weapons that are now used the world over, and it continues to pump out groundbreaking new systems that ensure it maintains an edge over its foes. A lot has changed in its short life. It no longer has to contend with other nations and their armies, but must instead fight terror groups embedded within civilian populations. That ensures controversy, as innocents will inevitably get caught in the crossfire and the IDF will take part of the blame, as is happening now in Gaza. But it has so far fulfilled its pledge to the nation of never losing a war, ensuring that Israel and its people endure. And it does not look likely to break that promise anytime soon.